I have heard of a land on a faraway strand. In the Bible, the story is told, where cares never come, never darkness nor gloom, and nothing shall ever grow old. In that beautiful land, on the faraway strand, no storms with their blast ever frown. The street, I am told, is paved with pure gold, and the sun, it shall never go down. There are evergreen trees that been low in the breeze, and their fruitage is brighter. So, session 8, I've entitled this Jesus as the New Moses. I think it may be titled something a little bit different on the syllabus. I can't remember. Um, I changed the title several times because I didn't like anything I came up with. But anyway, the aim of what we're talking about here today is to show that Matthew presents Jesus as a deliverer like Moses, a prophet like Moses, a lawgiver like Moses, however you want to define that. He's intentionally drawing Exodus parallels in Jesus' early life, not merely to create some kind of literary parallelism that reinforces anything, but primarily to show that the Moses Israel story was in fact a shadow, and that Jesus is the substance. And so the deliverance that happened in the Moses Israel story was a shadow of the deliverance that Jesus brings. The law that was given by Moses to Israel is a shadow of the law and the teaching that Jesus gives. And all of that, and the parallels are striking. And I think sometimes we read past it and don't even notice some of it. And so, we want to do that this morning. I want to turn your attention to begin with for some foundation considerations to Deuteronomy 18. Having exposure to the passages that we're going to quickly run through here, I think are important for our discussion. So Deuteronomy 18, verse 15, to begin with, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me. This is Moses speaking, by the way. Will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brothers. It is to him you shall listen. And we're going to skip a little bit down to 18 and 19 just for time's sake. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. And whoever will not listen to my words that he shall speak in my name, I myself will require it of him. I want to stop there for a moment. What does God mean when he tells Moses, whoever doesn't listen to my words that I give to him, I will require it of him? What does that mean? Right. He is going to hold them accountable for those words. That not listening is not an excuse. That in fact, he said, and we're going to see that in a moment, hear him. This is my beloved son, hear him. And therefore, not listening is not an excuse. It actually is the thing that brings judgment upon us. It's a reason. All right. I want to jump forward to Acts 3. Go ahead. Yeah. And I'll just go on record. We're not allowed to have side bars or side notes or rabbit trails in this class. Uh, Especially, you'll notice I never engage in them. Why y'all laughing at me? Chapter 3 of the book of Acts, verse 22 and 23. The downside of this Bible is it's in paragraph form and the verses are hidden. So I got to figure out where verse 22 starts. There it is. Moses said, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your brothers." Have you heard that? We just read it in Deuteronomy 18. So what we have here is a quote from Deuteronomy 18. Moses said, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your brothers. You must listen to everything he tells you, and everyone who does not listen to that prophet will be completely cut off from the people." Now, this is taken from the Septuagint, the Greek translation. And what it did was take that phrase that we just read from the Hebrew translation, "I will require it of you," and make a more descriptive, explanatory translation of it. "I will completely cut off from the people." That's what I mean by "I require." I'm going to use this to judge you. Which, by the way, is exactly what Jesus himself said about his word, right? In John 12:48, "The word in which I spoke will judge you in the last day." I'm going to require of you these things. So there is the application of Deuteronomy 18, 15 through 19 that we just read. In Acts 3, Peter here is preaching a sermon, and he says, Moses said these things, and Jesus is who he was talking about. That happens again in Acts chapter 7 and verse 37. We won't turn over there to read it, but Stephen does the same thing in his sermon. This is what Moses is talking about in Deuteronomy. Matthew 17:5, we've already looked at when God says, "Listen to him." What I do want to turn to and read, because we haven't looked at this passage, is John chapter 6 in verse 14. If I can find verse 14, there it is. When the people saw the sign he had done, again, this is speaking of Jesus. When the people saw the sign that he had done, and notice it calls it a sign here, not a miracle, because these were things that were done to signify something so that people would see and know something. They said, "This truly is the prophet who is to come into the world." You know what they were talking about? That prophecy of Moses from Deuteronomy 18. "I will raise up to you a prophet like me." When they heard Jesus teaching and they saw this sign, this group of people says, "This is the prophet." And then Hebrews chapter 3, verses 1 through 6 in the New Testament uses all of this Deuteronomy language and this thing that's laid out by Moses, and then makes the case that Jesus is greater than Moses. So those foundational things are important for what we're going to talk about this morning. Turn to Matthew 2, verses 1 through 18. I would love to read aloud all of these things. We just don't have time. I would no way in the world finish this material if we did that. I hope that you read before we got here today, and if you didn't, I hope that you'll read when you get home. Matthew records here in chapter 2, verses 1 through 18, that Herod sought to kill the child Jesus. Now, how bad did he want to kill Jesus? Well, he wanted to kill Jesus so bad, it is one child he wants dead. But what is his edict? Every male child under the age of 2 needs to be killed. He wants to be sure that the child that he's heard of that's been born is eliminated. So we have this slaughter of the male children of the Israelites. And this should immediately remind us of something. Pharaoh ordered the killing of all the male Hebrew children in Moses' time. Moses was a threatened child who was preserved by God. He was preserved by God through providence, and the providence is so detailed and so deep. Not only does he escape death through water, but on the river, he was called Moses. Why? Because he was drawn from the water. That's how he got his name. Not only did he escape death through water, but he gets into the hands of Pharaoh's daughter, non-Israelite, but who raises him? His own mother. And who does he save? His people. Now, that gets down in the story a little way, but even before that, in the middle of his life, when he's 40 years old, he sees a Hebrew being abused, and what does he do? He delivers him. There's already this foreshadowing going on. There's already these parallels to the life, and it starts with this deliverance from death, this protection that God gives him from the edict of Pharaoh. Jesus is also threatened as a child, but he is preserved by God. Matthew doesn't explain the connection. He expects the readers to recognize the connection. Now, there's a couple of reasons for that. Who is his primary audience? Jews. They should be familiar with the Old Testament scriptures. They should notice this. By the way, we should too. We should be familiar enough with the Word of God that when we read this, we go, hey, wait a minute. There's some parallels here. There's something similar here. This is the first signal that Jesus is being presented as a deliverer like Moses. The very first thing that Matthew records that tells us this is the prophet like Moses that we're supposed to listen to is this parallel account of their childhood. But Matthew's not merely saying Jesus is another Moses. He's preparing the reader to see that Moses' story pointed forward to Jesus. That the reason the circumstances of Moses' life were as they were is so that we would know who the Christ was. And that's another level of significance in the way that God works. God, through his providence, I'm not going to say created the circumstances, managed the circumstances, is the way I'll say it, of Moses' childhood to prepare people to recognize his Christ. Long before Jesus was born. Long before any of those things would happen. He arranged for this shadow, and he told the people through Moses, later in Moses' life, God is going to raise up a prophet like me, and he's going to put his words in his mouth, and you're going to need to listen to him, all to make it possible so that when Jesus came along and these things were seen, people would know this is the Christ. Again, the end of last week's study, so powerful. when the Roman soldiers saw what he saw and heard what he heard from Jesus on the cross, and what the text actually says is when he saw him die in this manner, his response was, truly, this was the Son of God. These things were so apparent, even the Gentiles who were familiar with the story of the Old Testament recognized them. Matthew assumes that anyone who's familiar with the story is going to see this. And so he doesn't have to say, hey, guys, pay attention. I'm talking about this. He expects you to know it. The flight from to Egypt, Matthew chapter 2, verses 13 through 15 and 19 through 21, kind of a little bit earlier in the text. It begins, the text we were already referencing, and then goes beyond it a little bit. Joseph takes Jesus to Egypt, and then later they return after Herod dies. That's part of his deliverance process. Then Matthew quotes, out of Egypt I have called my son, in Matthew chapter 2 and verse 15. Originally, we go back to the shadow. Where was Israel called from? Out of Egypt. How did they get to Egypt? This is a fascinating thing to actually consider. How did Israel end up in Egypt? Okay, yeah, so we've got this, again, very layered situation where the children of Israel, the man Israel, his sons are living in the land that they're living in, and a terrible famine arises. But decades before, what had they done with one of their brothers? Sold him into slavery, not to the Egyptians, but to some traveling Bedouins. But he ends up being sold by them to Potiphar and ends up in jail at Potiphar's house. Tells you how important Potiphar was. Potiphar had his own jail. Ends up at jail in Potiphar's house, and from there manages to get into contact, the strangest thing in the world, somebody in prison being given contact to Pharaoh. But he gets into contact with Pharaoh, is able to do something for Pharaoh, and is elevated into Pharaoh's service, and then ultimately elevated into the number one guy in the land. And because he's the number one guy in the land, and because he's prepared for this famine that arises, there's food in Egypt. There's not food anywhere else. And so all of these people, these descendants of Israel that are going to be the beginning of this nation, end up in Egypt looking for food, where Joseph then gets them all transferred there and moves them there to preserve them. And then God comes along 400 years later and calls them out of Egypt. And Matthew says, Jesus went to Egypt to be delivered from death, and then God called him out of Egypt. So there's parallel number two. They were both called out of Egypt. So Matthew's applying it to Jesus, and the pattern is very, very intentional. So the Exodus pattern is God's son, Israel, and his descendants are in Egypt. They are called out of Egypt. They pass through water in order for that to happen, right? They go through the Red Sea. Israel enters into the wilderness, and Moses then, after that, gives the law. In the Jesus story of Matthew, God's son, Jesus, ends up in Egypt. He's called out of Egypt. Jesus is baptized. We've already looked at that. After he's baptized, what happens? What's the very first thing that Matthew records after his baptism? He goes into the wilderness. He's led by the Spirit into the wilderness. Not accidental. It's intentional. And after that event, what does Jesus then do? He begins teaching. So we've got a parallel storyline in the opening of Matthew, identifying Jesus as the one that God would raise up in the place of Moses, all being laid out before the first record of anything Jesus teaches. Now, we're going to talk about chapter 4 in just a moment and dig into that a little bit as a shadow of, or as a substance of the shadow of Israel in the wilderness. But before we do that, I want to ask, do we remember what happens immediately in Matthew's gospel in chapter 5? Chapters 5, 6, and 7 are together the longest continuous teaching of Jesus we have recorded anywhere. We call it the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew lays out all this case, and then the very next thing in Matthew's gospel is Jesus on a mountain delivering the law of God. Who did that? Moses. All right, so let's look at Matthew 4 for a moment and see the parallel. After his baptism, Jesus is led into the wilderness to be tested. So we've already noticed Israel passed through the Red Sea. They entered the wilderness. They were tested in the wilderness. And they did what? They failed miserably. Jesus passes through baptism. He enters the wilderness. He's tested. What does he do? He remains faithful and true to the Word of God. And that's important too. And the way in which that happens is extremely important. Even the language that he chooses in the testing. Possibly, you could argue that the most important detail in the story is that Jesus answers every temptation by quoting what? The book of Deuteronomy. Specifically, passages where Moses is speaking to Israel about their wilderness failures. He uses direct quotes about what they didn't do in the wilderness to set against his doing it in the wilderness. Very important part of the purpose of this story and the way this story is told. The point is not merely that Jesus is repeating Israel's experience. The point is that Israel's experience under Moses was a shadow. It was a failure. It didn't accomplish the purpose, or Jesus is a success. It does accomplish the purpose. That also is a huge argument made in the book of Hebrews, is that the law didn't do what needed to be done. It was imperfect, but Christ did. He was perfect. Israel failed under Moses. Jesus proves to be faithful. The law is given through Moses. The greater law is given through Christ. And so immediately after this wilderness section, Matthew records a Sermon on the Mount, which is the very first introduction to the law of Christ. And repeatedly through that sermon, what does he do? Well, he makes allusions to the old law. You have heard that it was said. And then says what? But I say to you. Again, building on the contrast that Matthew's been building all the way from chapter 2 to chapter 4. Then the sermon's recorded, and the sermon is saying, this is what Moses said, but this is what I say. After Matthew's already pointed out that he's the prophet that Moses himself said is going to be raised by God after me, and God's going to put his word in his mouth. And if you don't listen to him, you're going to be condemned by God. Jesus follows that whole pattern and then says, this is what you must do. Because I'm telling you this, I say to you, which is also significant because as we read in other places in the New Testament, when people heard Jesus speak, they noticed something different about his teaching. He taught as one who had authority, not as their scribes taught. How did a scribe teach? I'm going to tell you, a scribe had better teach the same way that I try to teach, which is to do what? Build off of God's authority. This is what the scriptures say. Read it for yourself. This is what God would have us do. I don't tell anybody what they should do. If I offer my opinion on something, guess what it's as good as? It's about as good as belly button lint. Now, I might be correct in my opinion, but I might not. And you're not going to be judged by my opinion. God's not going to require of you my opinion. Do you know what he is going to require of you? What Christ just said. And so Jesus saying, you have heard, but I say, is pointing out that he is the prophet who has the words of the Father and is speaking with the authority of God. Not accidental. Not accidental that Moses went up on a mountain and then came down and gave the law, and Jesus went up on a mountain and preaches the law of the kingdom. Not accidental. We're not told that just because it's a neat little piece of information that makes the story more interesting. That he went up upon a mountain and sat down and began to teach. Isn't that interesting? It's setting the scene for us. No, not setting the scene for us. It's drawing the parallel between him and Moses. And so Matthew's deliberately moving the reader toward that comparison and making them realize Jesus is the one. And when you get, by the way, to later situations, you got the woman at the well who goes into the city and says, what? Hey, come and see, could this be the one? You got the disciples being called and going to their brothers, Peter and Andrew, for instance. Andrew first encounters the Lord and then goes and finds his brother Peter and says, what? I think I found the one in which the prophet spoke. Matthew is laying out the case so that we can do the same thing. Go, oh, Jesus is the one that God was talking about way back here in Deuteronomy 18 when Moses said God is going to raise up a prophet. Now, there were a lot of prophets between Moses and Jesus, but none of them compared to Moses the way Jesus did. And so all of that was so that we could identify Jesus as being the one, which is, by the way, what we already noticed at the beginning in the introduction in John 6, that the people who heard him that day came to realize he is the prophet. And the minute you put "the" in front of prophet, it makes it much more substantial. He's not a prophet. He's the prophet that was prophesied by Moses all those years ago. So shadows of the greater reality that are seen in this pattern in Matthew. Matthew's presenting this pattern so that we can see this. Pharaoh kills the children. Herod kills the children. Moses is preserved. Jesus is preserved. Israel is in Egypt. Jesus is in Egypt. Israel is called out of Egypt. Jesus is called out of Egypt. Israel goes through the Red Sea. Jesus is baptized. Wilderness testing follows the Red Sea. Wilderness testing follows the baptism. Israel fails their test. Jesus proves faithful. The work of Jesus is greater than that of Moses. Moses gives the law on the mountain. Jesus teaches the law on the mountain. Under the Moses story, there is physical deliverance of their bondage and their bodies. In the Jesus story, their spiritual deliverance. Here's where it's interesting. The shadow substance comparison, this one right here turns that on its head and teaches us something very important that we all miss. In our existence, in our lives, the substance is not material. The material is the shadow. Just like it was with them. Their physical deliverance was the shadow of the spiritual deliverance that Jesus would come to bring. Our substance is not the material that we're made of. Our substance is the spirit. So what did Jesus teach? Don't lay up for yourselves treasures on earth. Those things deteriorate. Those things are stolen. Those things fall apart. Instead, lay up for yourselves treasure in heaven, where the real substance is, even though it's not material. That's actually what's important. And we're seeing that contrast here. Moses gave the old covenant. What did Jesus bring? The new and better covenant. And so we've got this process and this contrast in the story of Matthew about Jesus that directly parallels the story of God and Israel in Moses. And then in the midst of that is Moses saying, a prophet like me is going to be raised. And it becomes very clear that Matthew is saying Jesus is that prophet. So you need to hear what he has to say. And then goes right into what? This is what he said. The Exodus story wasn't just history. It's not just recorded so we have a historical record of what happened. And in fact, there's a lot of things that we don't have a historical record about. What do we know about the 400 years that they were enslaved? Almost nothing. For 400 years, we know nothing. We know how they ended up being enslaved in general terms because a Pharaoh rose up who didn't know Joseph. We don't know anything about the process of how they were moved from being free, influential parts of the Egyptian society to being enslaved and used by Egypt. We don't know how that process worked, the steps that were taken, the people involved. That's not why it's recorded. It's not recorded so we have a historical record. It's preparing us to understand the Christ. Moses was the deliverer from Egypt. Jesus is the deliverer from sin. Moses gave the law at Sinai. Jesus gives the law of the kingdom of God to man. Moses led Israel to a land, a territory, a place on the globe. Jesus leads the people to the kingdom of heaven. My kingdom is not of this world. You can't say, lo, here it is, or there it is, because it's not a terrestrial kingdom. Matthew intentionally structures Jesus' early life to resemble the Exodus pattern. I would go a little further than understand I'm using Matthew there not as the man, but as the book. I would say actually Matthew intentionally highlights, if I want to be more accurate. I think that God, through providence, saw that these things came about so that the parallels existed, and that the book of Matthew highlights the parallels so that they are not missed. They're not accidental. Moses and Israel function as a shadow pointing toward Jesus. Jesus succeeds where Israel failed. Jesus is the faithful son. Did Moses enter the promised land? No. Did Jesus? Jesus ascended to his Father and entered into heaven. Another contrast. If you want to know why Moses, who nowhere in Bible is condemned by God as being unfaithful, was not allowed to enter the promised land, it's so that we can see that Jesus was superior to Moses and that Jesus' law is superior to the law of Moses. That's why he was not permitted to enter. You know why he got to see the promised land? You know, God took him up on a mountain and allowed him to see because of the graciousness of God. God didn't want him to not see the fruit of his work, but he didn't let him enter to teach us a lesson. After this section, Jesus goes up to teach. You better listen to what he says. Look at what happened to the children of Israel when they didn't listen to Moses. So we have all of these things. Matthew's building his case. He's not just telling stories. We don't have much between the birth and Jesus being 12 years old, and we have nothing between Jesus being 12 years old and Jesus being a grown man. Because we're not just getting the stories of his life. We're getting the pertinent pieces of his life that demonstrate who he is so that we can see who he is. Moses therefore serves as a pattern that we can use to recognize the spiritual lawgiver. And the contrast matters. That Israel failed their test and did not enter the promised land, that Moses was not allowed to go in, all is important to us being able to see the superiority of the work of Christ over the work of Moses. Both of them were delivering the law of God. Both of them had the authority of God behind them. But one was greater than the other. And so he demonstrates that for us. The law is given through Moses. The greater law is given through Christ. Anybody have any questions or comments about these things? Yep, go ahead.
Moses did not get to see the promised land because what did he say that how much longer shall it be? He equated himself with God in a sense. But Jesus, although he was equal with God, humbled himself. You see what I'm saying?
I know exactly what you're saying, and I think it's a good observation.
Second point is we see the body of Moses was disputed in the book of Jude between the angels, but Jesus' body never seen decay. So that's another analogy of the superiority and the divinity of Christ.
For those of you that don't know what he's talking about, Moses actually, at the second time that water was delivered from the rocks, got irritated with the people and took credit for supplying the water. Ironically enough, 1 Corinthians teaches us who was the rock? Christ. But Moses took credit. And that is among the things that kept him from entering the promised land. That was one of the consequences of him having done so. And yet the Bible is very clear that although Jesus existed in the form of God, he did not hold on to that, but he emptied himself and came in the form of a servant. It's also not by accident that we're actually told about Moses that he was the most humble man of his generation. But what that demonstrates to us is that Christ's humility was even greater. Again, underscoring through the comparison the message and why it is so important to listen to what Jesus taught. All right, got to stop. Appreciate everybody's presence and participation. Good class despite.
I have heard of a land on a faraway strand. In the Bible the story is told, where cares never come, never darkness nor gloom, and nothing shall ever grow old. In that beautiful land, on the faraway strand, no storms with their blast ever frown. The street, I am told, is paved with pure gold, and the sun it shall